Midnight in California. Through the fog, a grotesque, sprawling mansion rises like a haunting monument. 160 rooms, 2,000 doors, 10,000 panes of glass, and a secret the world has misread for over a century. The world calls Sarah Winchester a mad woman, an obsessed widow, building a senseless maze to outrun the ghosts of her past. Staircases leading straight into ceilings, windows opening onto solid walls, hallways ending in a void. The press of the time had a name for her, the Mad Widow of San Jose. But today, we peel back the lie. Because this house wasn't a trap for spirits. It was a clinical chart, written in timber, built from grief, and misunderstood by a world that wasn't ready to listen to the truth. This isn't a tour, this is a dissection. And as we strip away the layers of this labyrinth, you'll discover something the horror movies never wanted you to know. Sometimes, what they call madness is simply survival. But before we step into those halls, there is something I need to tell you. If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture, stories where every brick has a history and every wall hides a truth, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because what we're about to explore isn't just about a house. It's about how we misunderstand the pain of others. Now, let's begin. 1884, San Jose, California. There was a woman who lived in this house. But if you came to visit, you would never meet her. Sarah Winchester didn't entertain. There were no high society dinners, no aristocratic tea parties. Instead, when you stepped into the grand foyer, where Tiffany stained glass windows worth tens of thousands of dollars shimmered in the California sun, you heard only one thing: the sound of hammers, the scream of saws, and sometimes, if you stood still long enough, you'd hear the light, rhythmic footsteps of a woman moving through corridors only she knew how to navigate. This house wasn't just a small castle, it was an empire. Estimated at $5 million in 1922, that is well over $500 million in today's money. But no one was allowed to see inside, except for the workmen. Imagine this. You are a carpenter in San Jose in 1886. You've landed a job working for the wealthiest woman in the city. Her house is under construction. You think it will be a project of a few months, maybe a year. But when you show up on the first morning, the foreman hands you an architectural blueprint, and you look at it, and it makes absolutely no sense. A staircase leading straight into the ceiling. No exit, no escape. Just a set of stairs ending at a blank wall. You ask, is this a mistake? The foreman shakes his head. It's the way she wants it. So you build it. The next week, she asks you to build a door. A beautiful, solid oak door with intricate hand-carved details. You spend 3 days perfecting it. And when you finally open it, it opens into a wall. No room, no hallway, just a door leading to nowhere. Sarah Winchester didn't explain. She never explained. She simply paid. And the wages she paid? They were higher than anyone else in the valley. $3 a day when the market only paid $2. So you didn't ask questions, you just built. But here is what those workmen didn't know. And here is what the world wouldn't understand for decades. Every one of these insane choices, every staircase to nowhere, every door into a wall, every twisted hallway, was not the product of a deranged mind. They were products of fear, of guilt, and of a spiritual conviction Sarah Winchester held until her very last breath. If she ever stopped building, she would die. But to understand why she believed that, we have to go back. Back before this house existed. Back to the source of the fortune she inherited. Back to the weapon that built America and killed tens of thousands. We need to talk about the gun. 1866. A man named Oliver Winchester stands in his factory in New Haven, Connecticut. He holds a weapon that will rewrite history. The Winchester Model 1866. The gun that won the West. a lever-action rifle capable of firing 15 consecutive shots without reloading. In a world where most firearms fired once, then paused for a slow manual reload, this was a revolution. But let's be clear about what winning actually meant. It meant white settlers moving west with a technological advantage that indigenous tribes could not match. It meant the wild buffalo, the backbone of indigenous economy and culture, slaughtered en masse, sometimes purely for hide or sport. It meant frontier wars, bank robberies, and street shootouts, where this rifle became the symbol of both the law and the lawless. 1,870 to 150,000 rifles sold. 1875, over 500,000. 1880, nearly 1 million Winchester rifles in circulation across America, and every single rifle had the capacity to end 15 lives without a single pause. No one knows exactly how many died by the Winchester. Historians estimate the number in the tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands. Indigenous peoples, soldiers, outlaws, innocent civilians caught in the crossfire of history. But one thing is certain. Every bullet fired from a Winchester poured more gold into the Winchester family vaults. Oliver Winchester died in 1880, leaving behind an empire worth roughly $20 million, well over $600 million in today's money. But he wasn't the one left to manage this legacy. That was his son, William Wirt Winchester. And when William married Sarah Pardee in 1862, she, a highly educated New Haven girl who spoke 4 languages and loved music, suddenly became part of this lethal dynasty. Sarah had no choice in where her fortune came from. She didn't design the rifle. She didn't sell it. She didn't pull the trigger. But as she sat at lavish Winchester dinners, as she wore silk gowns from Paris bought with firearm profits, as she looked out the windows of the family estate, she knew that every silver spoon on her table, every candle in the crystal chandelier, every Persian rug beneath her feet was bought with blood. Then fate began to collect its debt. In 1866, the same year the Model 1866 rifle debuted, Sarah gave birth to a daughter, Annie Pardee Winchester. Her only child. The infant died after just 42 days. Marasmus, a form of severe malnutrition. Sarah would never have another child. 15 years later, in 1881, her husband, William Winchester, died of tuberculosis. He was only 43. And suddenly, Sarah Winchester, at age 42, was a childless widow inheriting 50% of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. Her passive income, roughly $1,000 a day. In 1881, that is the equivalent of nearly $30,000 a day in today's money. Over $10 million a year. From rifles, from death, from blood. And Sarah Winchester, the educated woman who loved music and architecture, the woman who had lost everything she loved, she sat in her empty mansion in New Haven. And she asked herself, is this a curse? And then someone gave her an answer. Boston, Massachusetts. 1884. Sarah Winchester enters a dim, shadowed room where heavy velvet curtains block out the daylight. On the table, a single candle flickers, and sitting across from her is a woman claiming to speak for the dead. Her name was Adam Coons, a prominent medium in the Boston high society circles of the Gilded Age. We don't know exactly what was whispered in that room. There are no transcripts, there were no witnesses, only Sarah and this woman, sitting in the dark, surrounded by whispers of restless spirits. But we know what happened afterward. And for us, that is everything. According to accounts Sarah later shared with a few close confidants, the medium gave her a terrifying ultimatum. Your daughter, your husband, they died because of a curse. The curse of the souls taken by the Winchester rifle. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. Indigenous peoples. Soldiers. The innocent bystanders. They are all searching for you. And if you stay here in New Haven, They will find you, and they will take everything you have left. But there was a way, one way to survive. Go west, the medium commanded. Find a piece of land and build a home for these spirits, a house large enough to hold them all, with enough rooms for them to wander, with enough hallways for them to get lost in. But never stop. If you stop building, they will know you are finished, and when the house is finished, you will be finished too. You will die. Now, sitting here more than 140 years later, we might say, that's absurd. We might say, Sarah Winchester was an educated woman. She spoke 4 languages. She understood science, music, and art. How could someone like that believe in something so illogical? But put yourself in her place. You are a 42-year-old woman. Your daughter died at only 6 weeks old. Your husband died at 43. Your in-laws are gone. You stand alone in a massive mansion with a fortune you never wanted, and every cent in that inheritance reminds you of the deaths it funded. Grief of this magnitude doesn't require logic. It requires an answer, any answer. And the medium gave Sarah an answer that, in her fractured mind, finally made sense. Her daughter didn't die from a random illness. Her husband didn't die from a random case of tuberculosis. They died for a reason. And if there is a reason, there is a way to fix it. 2 weeks later, Sarah Winchester bought a one-way ticket to California. She never returned to New Haven. She carried 3 things with her. 1. A massive fortune built on Winchester rifles. 2. The conviction that she was being hunted by thousands of souls. And 3. A simple, terrifying command. Build or die. And when she arrived in San Jose in the fall of 1884, she found a small farmhouse on 161 acres with 8 rooms. She didn't see a home. She saw a project that would last 38 years, and it would never be finished. Because on the very first day, Sarah Winchester took ownership. She issued an order that would define every remaining day of her life. Imagine you are a neighbor living near the Winchester farm in 1886. You go to bed at 10 p.m., just like everyone else in the quiet town of San Jose. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, you wake up. Not to a rooster's crow, not to church bells, but to the sound of hammers, the scream of saws, the heavy dragging of timber across the floorboards. You look out your window toward the Winchester estate, and you see light. Dozens of oil lamps flickering in the dark, shadows moving, and that relentless, unending pounding. This wasn't a one-time occurrence. This was every single night. For 38 years, from 1884 until 1922, the year Sarah Winchester passed away, the construction on this mansion never stopped. No weekends, no holidays, no winter breaks. 365 days a year, workmen labored in 24/7 shifts to transform a modest 8-room farmhouse into a 160-room labyrinth. Let me show you the true scale of this obsession. 1,884 to 8 rooms, 1,890 to 26 rooms, 1,895 to 48 rooms, 1,900, over 100 rooms. By 1906, just before the Great Earthquake, the mansion stood 7 stories tall, with a central tower rising 80 feet into the California sky. And every single night, Sarah Winchester held a meeting with her head foreman. Not in the morning, at midnight. Imagine you are John Hansen, a carpenter on this site. We'll talk more about him in a moment. You work the 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. shift. It's back-breaking labor, sawing oak, driving nails, hoisting 20-foot planks into place. You go home, eat dinner, and fall into bed. Then, at 2 o'clock in the morning, the foreman shakes you awake. She's changed her mind, he says. What? The staircase. She doesn't want it leading to the bedroom anymore. She wants it to go to the ceiling. You think he's joking, but he's not. Sarah Winchester, in the dead of night, has decided that the stairs you finished yesterday must be torn down and rebuilt. But this time, They will lead nowhere. Just a flight of steps, ending at a solid wall. The cost to maintain this permanent crew? Estimated at roughly $5,000 a year, just for wages. In 1890, that was a staggering sum. Today, that is the equivalent of about $150,000 a year in modern terms. And that's before materials. Sarah imported oak from the East Coast. Tiffany stained glass from New York. Marble from Italy. Teak from India. The total construction cost over 38 years? Estimated at over $5 million at the time. That is well over $150 million in today's money. But here's the most important thing you must understand. Sarah Winchester didn't build this house because she wanted a grand palace. She built it because she believed her life depended on it. Every hammer stroke at 2 a.m. was a prayer. Every new staircase, no matter where it led, was a shield against death. Every new door opening into a wall was a way to confuse the spirits hunting her. This wasn't architecture. This was a survival ritual, a form of prayer written in timber and nails, a way of saying to the universe, I am still here, I am still working. Please, do not take what I have left. And for 38 years the workmen came, they built, they tore down what they had just built, and they built it again. No one understood why. But they were all paid, and they all kept her secrets, because Sarah Winchester, the woman the world called mad, did something most Gilded Age elites never did. She treated them like human beings. But before we talk about those workmen, the invisible hands that truly built this labyrinth, we must understand its heart, the place where Sarah believed she spoke directly to the dead. We need to talk about the seance room. There is a room in the Winchester estate that no one was ever permitted to enter. No workmen, no servants, no guests, only Sarah. And, according to her conviction, the spirits of the dead. This room sits at the very heart of the house, at least the heart of the original design before the 1906 earthquake. It is not large, roughly 12 square feet. There are no windows looking out at the world. But it possesses a jarring detail. 7 small windows, all of them looking inward, peering into other rooms within the house. Not a single pane of glass connects to the outside world. It's as if this room was engineered to be a total severance from reality. Every night, at exactly 2 a.m., Sarah Winchester would enter this chamber, alone. She wore a black silk robe. She carried a single candle, and she locked the door behind her. No one knows exactly what transpired inside, but the servants, those forced to stay awake until the small hours to attend to her, they shared these accounts. They heard voices, not one voice, but many, as if a heated conversation were taking place. But when they pressed their ears closer, they realized every single voice belonged to Sarah. She was talking to them, to the souls she believed were hunting her, and more importantly, she was listening. Or at least, she believed she was. We know this because on the morning following every seance, Sarah would summon the head foreman, and she would hand him a slip of paper. On it were architectural sketches, not drawn by a professional architect, but drawn by Sarah's own hand, filled with bizarre, irrational details. A staircase with 44 steps that rose only 9 feet. A door on the second floor that opened directly into the backyard. No balcony, no steps, just a 15-foot vertical drop to the ground below. A winding hallway with 7 turns, just to travel 50 feet. Why? That is the question every servant, every worker, and every neighbor asked themselves. Why would an intelligent, highly educated woman with enough wealth to hire the finest architects in America spend her midnights sketching nonsense at 2 a.m.? The answer, for Sarah, was clinical. She wasn't the designer. She was the executor. The spirits were the architects. In Sarah Winchester's world, every staircase to nowhere was a trap to confuse the spirits. Every door into a wall was a dead end to leave them lost. Every winding corridor was a labyrinth, designed to keep them wandering, never finding the path to her bedroom. This wasn't mad architecture. In Sarah's mind, this was a defense system, a wooden shield against the invisible. And there was one more detail, a pattern that Winchester scholars have noted for decades. The number 13. Sarah Winchester was obsessed with it, not because it was unlucky, but because in her spiritual belief, it was sacred. The seance room had 13 coat hooks. Many staircases had 13 steps. The chandeliers often held 13 bulbs. Even her will, years later, would be signed in 13 separate parts. On the night of April 17, 1906, Sarah Winchester stepped into the seance room, as she always did. 2 a.m., alone, with her candle and her blank paper, ready to receive her instructions from the dead. But that night, before she could even light the wick, the entire house began to scream, not from ghosts, but because the very earth beneath her feet was tearing itself apart. And in 60 seconds, everything Sarah had built over 22 years was about to come crashing down. We need to talk about the earthquake that changed everything. If you visit the Winchester estate today as a tourist, guides will lead you through rooms they call evidence of madness. They will point out the bizarre details, and they will say, no one knows why. But that isn't the truth. We know exactly why. It's just that the reason doesn't live in the world of ordinary logic. It lives in the world of fear. Let's start with the most famous staircase, the 44 steps that rise only 9 feet. If you do the math, each step is only about 2 inches high. 2 inches. For comparison, a standard stair is 7 to 8 inches high. So why did Sarah demand these unnaturally shallow steps? The press of the time screamed, "She's mad!" But Sarah's medical history, notes we have from her private physician, reveals a different reality. Sarah Winchester suffered from severe rheumatoid arthritis. Arthritis, a disease that ravages the joints, particularly the knees and hips. As the condition progressed through the 1890s and 1900s, every step on a standard staircase became an agonizing ordeal. Imagine being a woman in her 50s. Every time you lift your leg 7 inches, the height of a normal step, pain jolts from your knee to your hip like an electric shock. But if you only have to lift your foot 2 inches, suddenly ascending to the second floor isn't a painful mountain to climb. It becomes possible. Now, let's talk about the doors to nowhere. There are at least 3 doors in the mansion that lead absolutely nowhere. One, the most famous, opens from the second floor directly onto the backyard. No balcony, no steps, just a 15-foot vertical drop to the ground below. Why would anyone build such a thing? Sarah's answer, to trap the spirits. In her spiritual worldview, the souls hunting her would wander the halls, testing every handle, and when they opened this door, they would fall, or at the very least, they would be confused. While they struggled to understand what had happened, Sarah bought herself time to escape to another wing of the house. Now we know that spirits don't have physical bodies. They don't fall downstairs. But Sarah believed they did, and in a mind fractured by loss, that belief wasn't madness. It was survival. Let's look at the windows. 2,000 windows. But many don't look outside. They peer into other rooms. A bedroom window looking into a hallway. A hallway window looking into the kitchen. A library window looking into a solid wall. Why? Because in Sarah's world, light was a weapon. Spirits, according to 19th century spiritualism, feared the light. By creating an internal network of windows, Sarah ensured that no corridor, no corner, was ever truly dark. There was always a sliver of light from somewhere. Always a way to see. Always a way to ensure you were never alone. And then there are the spiders. Throughout the Winchester estate, you'll see the spiderweb motif carved into wood, etched into glass, cast into iron. Not because Sarah loves spiders, but because in Native American cultures, the very people the Winchester rifle had decimated The spiderweb was a symbol of protection. It was a web to catch bad energy, a trap for malevolent spirits. Sarah Winchester wasn't building a home. She was building a fortress, a defensive labyrinth against an invisible enemy. Every detail, from the low steps to the doors to nowhere, served one singular purpose: to keep her safe, to keep her alive, to keep her protected from what she believed was hunting her. But at 5:12 a.m. on April 18, 1906, Sarah Winchester would learn a devastating lesson. No fortress, no matter how meticulously engineered, can protect you from the power of the ground beneath your feet. In less than a minute, her world would collapse, literally. That was the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, one of the greatest natural disasters in American history. 5:12 a.m. Sarah Winchester wakes up, not to the chime of a clock, but to the world tearing itself apart. The walls crack. Tiffany glass panes, worth tens of thousands of dollars, explode from their frames and shatter across the floorboards. The ceiling begins to descend in heavy plaster chunks. And the sound of the earth's crust snapping, is like a constant, deafening thunder. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake was a 7.9 magnitude monster. It lasted only 45 to 60 seconds, but those seconds were enough to level 80% of San Francisco, over 3,000 dead, over 225,000 left homeless, and in San Jose, roughly 60 miles south of the epicenter, the Winchester Mansion became one of the most ravaged structures in the valley. Sarah, now 67 years old, was in her bedroom when the tremor struck. She tried to run for the door, but it was jammed. The frame had twisted under the violent force of the tectonic shift. She was trapped. For the next 45 seconds, as her house collapsed around her, Sarah Winchester, the woman who had spent 22 years building a wooden shield to protect herself from ghosts, was facing an enemy she could not outsmart with a staircase to nowhere: nature itself. When the world finally went still, Sarah's servants, those who had escaped from other wings, took nearly half an hour to axe through the door and pull her out. She wasn't seriously injured. A few scrapes, shock, but she was alive. The house, however, was not so fortunate. The 7-story tower, Sarah's pride, the centerpiece that could be seen for miles, had completely pancosmed into a pile of rubble. The western walls had caved in. 3 massive chimneys had toppled, crushing the rooms below them. More than 30 rooms were damaged beyond repair. And the Seance room, the very heart of the labyrinth, was severely fractured. The estimated damage? Roughly $250,000 in 1906. Today, that is the equivalent of more than $8.5 million in modern currency. 22 years of continuous construction, millions in materials, and in less than a minute, a vast portion of it was returned to the dust. But here is the most critical thing to understand about Sarah's reaction. She didn't see this as a random natural disaster. She saw it as a message, a punishment, from the spirits. Remember, Sarah had spent 2 decades building on the conviction that if she satisfied the spirits, if she gave them enough rooms to wander, they would leave her in peace. But now, her 7-story tower, her most ambitious, most visible achievement, was gone. In Sarah's mind, that could only mean one thing: she had been wrong. The spirits didn't want her to build high. They didn't want her to display her wealth. They didn't want a tower that commanded the valley. They wanted her humble. They wanted her hidden. They wanted her to know her place. And so, Sarah Winchester made a decision that would define the final 16 years of her life. She ordered her workmen to permanently seal off the 30 damaged rooms. No repairs, no rebuilding, just close them, nail them shut, and never open them again. Those rooms, where Tiffany glass once caught the sun, where Persian rugs once lay thick, where she had walked every day, now became tombs. Tombs for her ambition, for her pride, for the idea that she could ever build something truly permanent. But Sarah did not stop building. She couldn't, because in her worldview, the earthquake wasn't a reason to quit. It was a reason to continue, but differently. No more building up. No more building for show. Build to hide. Build to survive. Build to apologize. 1 week after the quake, the hammers returned. The workmen went back to work. But this time, they weren't raising spires. They were building hallways to nowhere. Tiny rooms that no one would use. Windows that peered into walls. Before 1906, Sarah Winchester built to create something. After 1906, she built to avoid becoming nothing. The difference is profound, and it explains why the final 16 years of her life, from 1906 to 1922, produced the most bizarre, chaotic, and tragic sections of the Winchester Mansion. It was the architecture of surrender, of fear, and of a woman trying to make herself invisible. But there was one thing Sarah never made invisible: the people who built it all for her. Now it is time we talk about them. The workmen, the craftsmen, the real human beings who turned Sarah's spiritual nightmare into a reality of timber and nails. We have spent a lot of time talking about Sarah Winchester, about her grief, her convictions, her bizarre architectural choices. But there is a truth that most stories about the Winchester Mystery House ignore. Sarah Winchester didn't build this house. She never held a hammer. She never sawed a plank. She never drove a single nail. This house was built by men, with names, with families, with calloused hands and aching backs, and it is time we talk about them. 1895. A man named John Hansen, 42 years old, walks into the foreman's office at the Winchester estate. He is a carpenter. A Danish immigrant. He's been in the trade for 20 years. His hands are rough, his fingernails permanently stained by wood dust. His back is slightly hunched from 2 decades of bending, lifting, and carrying 50-pound timber planks. John Hansen has a wife, Anna, and 3 children. They live in a small, rented house in San Jose. The rent, $12 a month. The average wage for a carpenter at the time, $2 a day. If he works 6 days a week, he makes $48 a month. After the rent, that leaves $36 to feed 5 people. But when John Hansen begins working for Sarah Winchester, everything changes. She pays him $3 a day. Not 2. 3. That is $72 a month, a 50% increase over the market rate. In today's money, that is the difference between earning $4,000 a month and $6,000 a month. For an immigrant family, that is the difference between surviving and thriving. But the wages weren't everything. Let me read you an entry from the Winchester Farm Ledger, 1896. Workmen shall be provided with a hot lunch daily, prepared by the kitchen staff. Menu includes meat, potatoes, vegetables, and fresh bread. No deduction from wages. A free lunch. Not dry bread and hard cheese, but a real meal. Meat, vegetables, and pies, baked in the mansion's kitchen by professional chefs. And there was this. In 1898, John Hansen's youngest son, Eric, age 7, developed a high fever. A local doctor diagnosed it as diphtheria, a lethal disease at the time, especially for children. The cost of treatment, $50, nearly a month's salary for John. John Hansen didn't have $50. But when the foreman heard the news, he went to Sarah Winchester. The next day, a doctor, not a local one, but Sarah's private physician from San Francisco, arrived at the Hansen home. He treated Eric. He returned every day for a week. He left behind medicine. And when John Hansen asked about the bill, the foreman shook his head. Mrs. Winchester has seen to it. No deduction from his pay. No debt contract. Just care. John Hansen was not the exception. This was how Sarah Winchester treated all her workmen. In an era where industrial titans on the East Coast were exploiting workers with 12-hour days, slave wages, and dangerous conditions, Sarah Winchester, the woman the world called mad, created a working environment that any Gilded Age laborer would have dreamed of. Wages, 50% higher than the market. Meals, free, hot, and nutritious. Medical care, covered for the workmen and their families. Hours. They could be strange, 2 a.m., but they were paid by the hour, no exploitation. Time off. Workmen could request time for family matters and still receive their pay. And this is why, when journalists from San Francisco came to write sensationalist hit pieces about the Mad Widow, not a single workman spoke up. Not one person sold their story to the press. Not one person betrayed Sarah Winchester. Because loyalty cannot be bought with money. But it can be earned. With respect. With empathy. With treating human beings as human beings, not as replaceable parts in your construction machine. John Hansen worked at the Winchester Mansion from 1895 until 1914, nearly 20 years. He built the staircases to nowhere. He framed the doors that opened into walls. He sawed the planks for the winding hallways with no exit. And every time he held his hammer, every time he drove a nail into these senseless structures, he knew he was working for a woman who had saved his son's life. That isn't madness, that is gratitude. And this is what the Winchester story often ignores. Sarah Winchester inherited a fortune built on death, on rifles, on blood. But she transformed a portion of that fortune into something else. Wages, meals, medical care, hope. The Winchester rifle took thousands of lives, but the Winchester Mansion, the 38-year construction project, sustained dozens of families. It gave the children of craftsmen like John Hansen a chance to go to school. It paid the rent. It paid the doctor's bills. It turned blood money into bread money. And when John Hansen passed away in 1921, 1 year before Sarah Winchester, he was buried in Oak Hill Cemetery in San Jose. On his headstone is an inscription carved by his family, a craftsman, a father, a man of honor. There is no mention of the Winchester Mansion. There didn't need to be, because John Hansen didn't need a bizarre palace to prove his worth. He proved it with his hands, with his sweat, by showing up every day for 20 years to build someone else's strange dream, and in doing so, building a better life for his own family. That is the true legacy. But while Sarah Winchester was treating her workers with dignity, the world outside was spinning a completely different story about her. March 1906, 2 weeks before the earthquake. On the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle, a headline screams, "Mad Widow Builds House for Ghosts." Sarah Winchester, the richest woman in San Jose, believes she is cursed by souls slain by the Winchester rifle, building a senseless labyrinth to escape her fate. The article continues. Neighbors report that Mrs. Winchester never leaves her property. She lives as a hermit, obsessed with delusions of otherworldly revenge. San Francisco psychiatrists, when asked about her condition, suggest this may be a case of female hysteria or early-onset dementia. Stop. Let's stop right there. There is a massive problem with this story. Actually, there are several. But let's start with the biggest one. No psychiatrist had ever examined Sarah Winchester. The journalist who wrote that piece had never met her. And the term female hysteria, a fraudulent medical diagnosis used to invalidate wealthy, independent women, was the favorite tool of the 19th century press when they didn't understand a woman. So what is the truth? Let me read you an entry from the actual medical records of Sarah Winchester. These are the notes from her private physician, Dr. Arthur Bright, dated November 14, 1898. Patient, Mrs. Sarah L. Winchester, age 59. Diagnosis, rheumatoid arthritis, advanced stage. Symptoms, severe swelling and stiffness in both knees, hips, and hands. Patient reports acute pain when performing ordinary activities, such as climbing stairs, opening doors, or gripping heavy objects. Treatment, aspirin for pain management. Rest, avoidance of physical strain. Notes. Patient refuses to reduce daily activity. She insists that moving through her house is necessary for her mental well-being. Rheumatoid arthritis. Not hysteria, not dementia, not madness, but real, measurable, agonizing physical pain documented by a licensed medical doctor. Now, let me explain to you what rheumatoid arthritis actually meant in 1898, before modern anti-inflammatories existed. RA is an autoimmune disease. The body's immune system attacks its own joints. The joints swell. The cartilage erodes. Bone grinds against bone. Imagine you are Sarah Winchester in 1898. You are 59 years old. Every morning you wake up, your knees are as stiff as timber. It takes 10 minutes just to bend them enough to stand. As you walk, every step sends jolts of pain from your heels to your hips like an electric shock. And stairs? A standard staircase with 7 to 8 inch steps? That is torture. Now, look back at the architecture of the Winchester Mansion, the 44 steps that rise only 9 feet. Each step is exactly 2 inches high. This isn't madness. This is engineering. It is an ergonomic solution to a physical medical problem. If you cannot lift your leg 7 inches without screaming, you design a staircase where you only have to lift it 2. Today, we call this inclusive design. We build wheelchair ramps. We install grab bars in bathrooms. We lower counters for those with limited mobility. And no one calls these adjustments crazy. We call them humane, logical, essential. But in 1906, when a wealthy woman designed her home to accommodate her broken body, the newspapers called her insane. Look closer. The doors with special handles, designed to be opened with an elbow instead of a hand? That's because the arthritis in Sarah's fingers made twisting a traditional doorknob a nightmare. The low windows, sitting just 2 feet off the floor. That was so Sarah could see outside even while seated, as standing for long periods caused her joints to throb. The wide hallways, double the standard width? That's because as the disease progressed, Sarah began using canes, and eventually a wheelchair. She needed the clearance to move. Notes from Dr. Arthur Bright, 1912. Patient is now 73. Arthritis has progressed significantly. She is now dependent on a wheelchair for most movement. However, her mood remains good. Her intellect is as sharp as ever. She continues to manage her personal finances and construction projects with remarkable precision. Intellect remains sharp. Not demented. Not delusional. Sharp. So why did the press label Sarah Winchester as mad? I'll tell you why. Because wealthy woman designs brilliant home to accommodate medical condition is not a catchy headline. But mad widow builds house for ghosts? That is tabloid gold. And Sarah Winchester, a private woman who refused interviews and never defended herself in public, was the perfect target. She couldn't refute the lies because doing so meant exposing her private spiritual beliefs, something she knew would only make things worse, so she stayed silent. And in that silence, the world was free to invent any story it wanted. So here's the truth. Sarah Winchester was not a madwoman building a house for ghosts. She was a woman in chronic pain who designed a house where she could live without hurting every second. And alongside that, she also believed in spirits. The two can coexist. A person can be both brilliant and superstitious, logical and spiritual, in pain and in faith. But in 1906, the world wasn't ready for that complexity. They wanted a simple story, and Sarah Winchester paid for that simplicity with her reputation. But regardless of what the world thought, Sarah Winchester kept living, and in her final years she would retreat even deeper into her private world. 1922. Sarah Winchester is 83 years old. She has lived within this mansion for 38 years. She has built it without pause, day after day, year after year, clinging to the conviction that if she ever stopped, she would die. But now, her body is issuing its own final decree. The rheumatoid arthritis has progressed to the point where she can barely move. Even with her wheelchair, traveling from one wing to another has become a grueling expedition. Her hands, the hands that once sketched intricate, bizarre blueprints at 2 a.m., are now too swollen and painful to hold a pin. And the hammers, the rhythm that has defined her life for nearly 4 decades, begin to slow. It wasn't that Sarah ordered the work to stop. She never did. But the projects grew smaller, simpler. A door repair here, a window casement replaced there. No more ambitious towers. No more complex staircases to nowhere. Just maintenance. As if the house, much like its owner, was finally learning how to accept its age. September 4th, 1922. Sarah Winchester wakes in her bedroom, but not the grand bedroom, the opulent suite with the canopy bed and thousands of dollars in Tiffany glass. Instead, she is in a small room on the first floor. Simple, near the kitchen, easily accessible by wheelchair. The room contains a bed, a chair, a wardrobe, a single window looking out onto the garden. There is no Tiffany glass here, no $1,000 oak paneling, no intricate carvings, just 4 walls, and the California sunlight streaming across the floor. This is where Sarah Winchester chose to spend her final hours. Not in the seance room, not in the grand ballroom, but in a quiet, functional room bathed in natural light. On the morning of September 5th, Sarah's housekeeper, a woman named Henrietta Sievers, who had served her for over 20 years, walked into the room to bring her breakfast. She called Sarah's name. There was no answer. Sarah Winchester had passed away in her sleep, peacefully, without pain, surrounded by the very sunlight she had once tried to trap within her internal windows. There was no final hammer stroke, no final seance, no architectural instructions scribbled in the dead of night, only silence. As the news spread, the workmen, some of whom had been on the site for decades, simply set their hammers down, not because they were ordered to, but because they knew. The house was finished, not because the blueprints were complete, but because the only person who knew how to continue the dream was gone. For 38 years, Sarah Winchester built because she believed that if she stopped, she would die. And in a strange way, she was right. Within weeks of the final hammer falling silent, she was gone. It was as if the house and the woman were connected by an invisible thread. And when that thread snapped, they both stopped. Sarah Winchester was buried in Evergreen Cemetery in New Haven, Connecticut. Not in California, where she had spent half her life, but in Connecticut, beside her husband and her daughter, beside William, beside little Annie. Her headstone is remarkably simple, just a name, date of birth, date of death. There is no mention of the mansion, no reference to the 160 rooms, nothing about the staircases to nowhere or the doors to avoid. It simply reads, Sarah Lockwood Winchester, 1839 to 1922. And back in California, the Winchester Mansion stood still. For the first time in 38 years. No hammers, no saws, no workmen, just 160 empty rooms. 2,000 windows reflecting the sun, 10,000 panes of glass shimmering in the quiet, and miles of winding corridors that now truly led to nowhere. The house was finally at rest, but its story was only just beginning. Because when Sarah Winchester died, her heirs, those who had never set foot inside the estate, had to decide what to do with this bizarre, expensive legacy. October 1922, 1 month after Sarah Winchester's passing, a group of lawyers and heirs step into the Winchester Mansion for the very first time. Most had never met Sarah. Some didn't even know she existed until they received a letter from her attorneys. And now, they stand in the foyer of one of America's most bizarre structures, trying to make sense of what lies within. Leading the group is a lawyer named Marion Merriman. He carries a blank ledger, a pen, and a great deal of patience, because he knows this task will take weeks. Imagine you are Marion Merriman. You walk into the first room. It is filled with wooden crates, dozens of them. Some are locked, some are not. You pry open the first one, and inside are silk gowns, 12 of them. never worn, still bearing their price tags from Paris. Crate number 2, footwear. 20 pairs of handmade Italian leather shoes, never touched a floor, some still wrapped in their original tissue paper. Crate number 3, sterling silver service, enough to feed 50 guests, never used, still in their wooden boxes from the manufacturer in London. Merriman continues, room after room, hallway after hallway, and he discovers 2,000 tablecloths never unfolded, 400 pieces of furniture, chairs, tables, armoires, still in their shipping wraps, hundreds of books in French, German, and Spanish. Sarah was fluent in all 4, a music library with over 300 scores, and the pianos, 4 grand pianos, in a house where only one person lived. This is the strange reality of extreme wealth. You can buy everything, but you cannot use it all. In the end, these things simply accumulate as monuments of solitude. But the most significant discovery wasn't the unworn gowns or the silent pianos. It was what Merriman found in Sarah's private office, a small room on the first floor where she managed her empire. In her desk drawer, he finds a ledger, meticulously documented, in her own hand, every single transaction over 38 years. March 15, 1895, payment of workmen's wages, $890. June 22, 1898, donation to San Jose Children's Hospital, $500. Donations? Merriman flips the pages, and he sees hundreds of entries for hospitals, for orphanages, for local charities. Most were made anonymously. No Sarah Winchester in the press. No request for recognition. Just money. Silent. Constant. When Merriman tallies the total, he discovers that over 38 years, Sarah Winchester donated more than $2 million to charity. In 1922, $2 million was an astronomical sum. Today, that is the equivalent of over $35 million in modern currency, done in total secrecy. The woman the world called mad, selfish, and obsessed had been quietly funding the health care of thousands of children. But the final discovery, the one that forced the lawyers to read it 3 times to be certain, was Sarah's will. It was 13 pages long, signed in 13 separate parts. I, Sarah Lockwood Winchester, being of sound mind and memory. Of sound mind. That is how she began, as if she knew the world would question her sanity, and she wanted to ensure there was no doubt. The will divided her fortune, the house, and 161 acres, left to her niece, Marion Marriott. The Winchester repeating arm stock, divided among various heirs. Cash and bonds, roughly $20 million, divided among family, loyal employees, and charities. But this is what surprised the lawyers most. Sarah left money to her servants, not just a symbolic gesture, but substantial, life-changing sums. Henrietta Severs, the housekeeper, $5,000. Today, that is the equivalent of roughly $90,000. The long-term footmen, $2,000 to $3,000 each. The gardeners, the drivers, the cooks, everyone was remembered. In an era where most elites treated servants as furniture, replaceable and forgettable, Sarah Winchester remembered them by name. She acknowledged their years of service with true financial dignity. When the inventory was finally complete, after 6 weeks of prying open crates and counting every penny, Merriman sat down to write his final report. Total estate value, real estate, house plus land, $5 million in 1922. Stocks and bonds, $20 million. Personal property, furniture, art, clothing, $3 million. A total of roughly $28 million. In today's money, That is over $500 million. Sarah Winchester had passed away as one of the wealthiest women in America. But here is what the papers would never print. She had lived simply, she had given generously, and she had died alone, yet beloved by the people who actually knew her. Not the world that read the tabloids, but the people who worked in her home. The men who ate the lunches she provided. The families whose medical bills she paid in silence. But now, with Sarah gone, one question remained. What do you do with a house like this? And that was when someone had an idea that would turn a spiritual tragedy into a tourist attraction. February 23, 1923. Less than 5 months after Sarah Winchester's passing, a line of people, stretching over 3 miles, stands waiting outside the Winchester gates. They aren't heirs. They aren't attorneys. They are tourists, and they are queuing to see the most famous haunted house in America. But let's step back. Who decided that a private home where a woman had just died should be transformed into a commercial spectacle? And more importantly, who decided that the best way to sell tickets was by selling ghosts? His name was John H. Brown, a local real estate promoter, and when he heard of Sarah's death, he didn't see a tragedy, he saw a gold mine. John Brown approached the heir, Marion Marriott, Sarah's niece, with a cold proposition. You cannot live here. The house is too vast, too bizarre, too expensive to maintain, but I can turn it into a profitable asset, open it to the public, charge an admission fee. I'll manage everything. You just collect the checks. Marion agreed, and John Brown went to work. But here was the problem. If you simply say, this is a large house with many rooms, no one cares. People don't pay to see real estate. They pay to see a story. And John Brown knew exactly which story would sell. This was the very first ad he ran in the San Jose Mercury Herald, February 1923. The Winchester Mystery House. Step inside the most cursed mansion in America. See the staircases to nowhere, the doors that open into darkness, built by a mad widow to escape the spirits of the dead, only 50 cents per person. To be clear, nothing in that ad was technically false. There were staircases to nowhere. That was a fact. There were doors opening into walls. Also a fact. Sarah had believed in spirits. Fact. But the way the story was told, that is where the truth was bent into a lure. When tourists entered the mansion in 1923, they were led by guides John Brown had personally trained, and these guides were instructed to tell a specific narrative. You are now standing in the Seance room, where Mrs. Winchester spoke to ghosts every night at 2 a.m. Her servants reported hearing whispers, footsteps, and strange lights moving through the halls when no one was there. Some say that even now, Sarah Winchester's spirit wanders these corridors, still building, still running. Now compare that to the truth. Sarah didn't talk to ghosts. She sought direction in her grief. No one ever witnessed anything supernatural. The whispers were the wind through miles of hollow corridors. The strange lights were the moon reflecting off 2,000 panes of glass. But maybe doesn't sell tickets. Haunted does. And it worked. Miraculously. In the first month alone, over 12,000 people paid for the tour. In the first year, over 150,000 visitors, each paying 50 cents. 50 cents in 1923 is roughly equivalent to $9 today. The first year's revenue, $75,000. In 2025 terms, that is over $1.3 million from a house where John Brown simply had to open the door. Here is the ultimate irony. Sarah Winchester spent 38 years trying to keep the world out. She built walls. She created labyrinths. She refused interviews. She lived in total secrecy, and less than a year after she died, thousands of strangers were walking through her bedroom, touching her furniture, standing in her seance room. The privacy she fought her entire life to protect? It was now worth 50 cents. But John Brown didn't stop there. As the years passed, he kept adding to the myth. 1924, He started special midnight ghost tours at a higher price. 1925. He hired mediums to hold public seances at the mansion. 1926. He allowed Hollywood to film on site, on the condition they emphasize the haunted angle. And with every passing year, the real story, the story of a woman in chronic pain who designed a house to accommodate her broken body, faded. It was replaced by a story that sold tickets, a story of ghosts, of curses, of madness. Today, the Winchester Mystery House welcomes over 300,000 visitors a year. Standard admission, roughly $40. Annual revenue, over $12 million. And guess which part of the tour is emphasized most? Not the 2-inch steps designed for her arthritis. Not Sarah's generosity toward her workmen. Not the $2 million in silent charity she left behind. But the curse. Always the curse. Because pain doesn't sell tickets. Kindness doesn't sell tickets. Human complexity doesn't sell tickets. But ghosts? Ghosts always sell. And that is how a legacy is rewritten, not by truth, but by profit. But if we ignore the ghost story, if we look back at what Sarah actually built, what do we see? 2018, nearly a century after Sarah Winchester's passing. A team of structural engineers from the University of California was invited to the Winchester estate to conduct a study. Their mission? To analyze the quote-unquote architectural blunders that the world had ridiculed for over 100 years. And what they discovered changed everything. Let's start with that 44-step staircase. Remember it? The one the press called evidence of madness? It rises 9 feet, but is divided into 44 steps, each step exactly 2.45 inches high. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the lead researcher, wrote in her report, "To create a staircase with this slope while maintaining structural stability is a significant engineering challenge. Each tread must be deep enough to support an adult, minimum 10 inches. But with a rise of only 2.45 inches, the rise-to-run ratio is 1:4, a ratio most architects today would deem unfeasible due to cost and complexity. Yet this staircase has stood for over 120 years without a single sign of structural failure." In other words, this wasn't a mistake. It was a feat of engineering. Now, let me explain why this matters from a medical and ergonomic perspective. When a person with advanced arthritis climbs a standard staircase, their knee joints must 1. Lift the entire body weight 7 to 8 inches. 2. Endure a compressive force on the cartilage 3 to 4 times their body weight. 3. Repeat this motion for every step, usually 12 to 15 times to reach a single floor. But with Sarah's staircase, the biomechanics are entirely different. 1. The knee only has to lift 2.45 inches, reducing compressive force by 70%. 2. The quads and calf muscles work gently, as if walking on a slight incline rather than climbing a slope. 3. Though there are more steps, 44 instead of 12, the total energy expenditure and pain are drastically reduced. Today we call this universal design. Have you noticed the gentle ramps in modern hospitals? The shallow rise steps in physical therapy centers? That is the exact principle Sarah Winchester applied in 1886, over 100 years before the term medical ergonomics was even invented. Now, let's talk about material choice. Dr. Rodriguez and her team analyzed the wood used in this specific staircase, and they found this. Sarah didn't use cheap California pine. She used ebony, imported from West Africa. Why? Ebony has 3 critical properties. 1. High density. It doesn't sag or warp over time, even with these extremely thin steps. 2. Natural smooth surface. It reduces friction, allowing a foot to glide gently rather than catch on the surface, critical for someone with ankle arthritis. 3. Superior pest resistance, ensuring the structure wouldn't weaken over decades. The cost? Ebony in 1895 cost roughly $50 per cubic foot. Sarah needed about 200 cubic feet for this staircase. The total cost for materials alone, $10,000 in 1895. Today, that is the equivalent of over $350,000 for a single staircase. This wasn't the squandering of a madwoman. This was the investment of an engineer. Someone who understood that if you build something to be used every day for decades, you build it the right way. And there is one final detail most tourists never notice. The angle of the staircase is not a straight line. It is curved, very slightly, exactly 3 degrees. Dr. Rodriguez noted, this curve creates a natural rhythm for the gait. It encourages the climber to lean into the handrail, offloading the weight from the knee and hip joints. This is a profound biomechanical insight that we only achieve today through computer simulations and medical research. Sarah Winchester didn't have a computer. She had no engineering degree. She had no formal training in architecture. But she possessed something that cannot be taught. She understood her own body. Think about this for a moment. Every day, for years, Sarah climbed these stairs. Every day she felt every step. She knew which tread caused more pain. She knew which angle was more comfortable. She knew which curve helped her keep her balance. And then she worked with craftsmen like John Hansen to adjust, to experiment, to perfect, until she created a staircase that wasn't just usable, but a staircase that transformed movement from agony into possibility, from torture into freedom. And this staircase wasn't unique. Throughout the Winchester Mansion, if you know how to look, you will see it. L-shaped door handles, which can be opened with an arthritic elbow instead of a hand. Elevated sinks, removing the need to bend over. Low windows, operable even from a seated position. Wide hallways, clearing space for canes, and eventually, her wheelchair. Dr. Rodriguez concluded her report with this sentence: "The Winchester Mansion is not an architectural oddity. It is a museum of adaptive design, built by an end user who understood her own needs better than any professional architect could have imagined." If Sarah Winchester lived today, she would be hailed as a pioneer in medical ergonomics. But she didn't live today. She lived in 1886, and so instead of being celebrated as an innovator, she was called mad. That is the price of being ahead of your time, especially if you are a woman. But today, more than a century later, the world is finally beginning to understand what Sarah was trying to tell us. 1961. A filmmaker named William Castle stands before the gates of the Winchester estate with a script in his hand. He isn't there to film a documentary. He wants a horror movie, full of blood, screams, and shadows leaping from the corners. The estate manager looks at the script. He looks at William Castle, and he says no. But that didn't stop Castle. He filmed elsewhere, but he titled his movie 13 Ghosts, a direct nod to Sarah's obsession with the number 13. At the premiere, he told the press, "This story was inspired by the Winchester Mansion, the real haunted house." The problem? There were no ghosts. There were no 13 vengeful spirits. There was no actual curse. There was only a woman in chronic pain and a house engineered to accommodate it. But Hollywood doesn't care about the truth. They care about opening weekend. And that was only the beginning. Over the next 60 years, the Winchester Mansion has been featured in over 30 movies and television shows, hundreds of books, from gothic horror to ghost hunting guides, countless paranormal podcasts, video games, including a 2012 title where you survive the night in the haunted estate, and finally, a massive 2018 Hollywood production starring Helen Mirren as Sarah Winchester. That film features a scene where Sarah uses a Winchester rifle to shoot at ghosts. Let's be clear, that never happened. Sarah Winchester loathed guns. She never owned a Winchester rifle. But once again, truth doesn't sell tickets. Ghosts do. Then came the internet, and with it, a new generation of self-proclaimed ghost hunters. On Reddit, you will find thousands of threads dedicated to the Winchester Mystery House. I saw a figure in the hallway during my tour. Did anyone else hear footsteps when no one was there? I think Sarah opened a portal to hell. The theories are endless. Theory 1. Sarah was a high-level witch, and the house is a massive occult ritual. Theory 2. The staircases to nowhere are actually dimensional portals to other planes of existence. Theory 3. Sarah hid a multi-million-dollar treasure within the walls, and the fake doors are clues to its location. Theory 4. The house was built on an ancient energy vortex, or Native American ley lines. All of it is false. Every single one. Sarah wasn't a witch. She was a devout Christian. There are no dimensional portals, just ergonomic solutions. There is no hidden treasure. Her financial records were fully audited in 1922. And energy vortexes? The house was built on an ordinary apricot orchard. But here is the fascinating part. It doesn't matter how many times the facts are published. It doesn't matter how many historians debunk the myths. It doesn't matter how many engineers explain the architecture. People want to believe in the ghosts. Why? I think it's because the ghost story is easier. It's simpler. It's less painful. Because if Sarah Winchester was just a madwoman obsessed with spirits, then we don't have to face the difficult questions. We don't have to talk about chronic, debilitating arthritis in elderly women. We don't have to confront the reality of deep grief and loss. We don't have to ask how society treats wealthy, independent women who refuse to conform. We don't have to examine the source of the fortune, the rifles, the violence, and the true cost of winning the West. But if Sarah was just a woman in pain, then we have to face all of it. And that is hard. It is complex. It is uncomfortable. So we choose the ghosts. The Swiss psychologist Carl Jung had a term for this, the Rorschach test, an ambiguous image that people project their own fears, hopes, and beliefs onto. And that is exactly what the Winchester Mansion has become. It isn't a house anymore. It is a test. If you believe in the paranormal, you see evidence of spirits. If you believe in conspiracy, you see secret codes and hidden rituals. If you are a feminist, you see a woman labeled mad by a patriarchal society for daring to be different. If you are an engineer, you see innovative design decades ahead of its time. If you are a class critic, you see a monument to the excess of the Gilded Age. All of these interpretations contain a sliver of truth, but none of them are complete. Because Sarah Winchester, like all of us, was not a simple story. She was a living contradiction. She was both incredibly wealthy and profoundly lonely. She was brilliant, yet superstitious. She was generous to her workmen, yet distant from the world. She was a victim of a ravaging disease and the architect of her own relief. She was the inheritor of blood money and the woman who turned it into bread money. Today, as more than 300,000 people a year walk through the corridors of the Winchester Mansion, each one carries their own story of her. Some see a lunatic, some see a genius, some see a victim, some see a heroine. And perhaps that is exactly why the house refuses to be forgotten, because it is large enough, literally and figuratively, to hold every one of those interpretations, every one of those stories, every one of those truths. 160 rooms, miles of corridors, and still enough space for everyone to find what they are looking for, whatever that may be. But as the generations pass, one thing has changed: the way we look at Sarah Winchester herself. In 1923, the New York Times wrote of Sarah Winchester's passing, "The singular woman of San Jose, haunted by evil spirits, has died in the solitude she so strictly chose for herself." In 1950, a California history book labeled her a tragic example of how extreme wealth and superstition can erode a once fragile mind. In 1975, a magazine feature described her as the unfortunate victim of grief and the exploitation of spiritualist charlatans. But in 2010, the tide began to turn. A historian named Mary Jo Ignafo published a groundbreaking biography, Captive of the Labyrinth, Sarah L. Winchester, Heiress to the Rifle Fortune. This was the first serious scholarly investigation into Sarah, based on actual records, not campfire tales. And she wrote this in the preface. Sarah Winchester was not a mad woman. She was a successful businesswoman, a sharp-witted manager of wealth, and a substantial philanthropist. The truth of her life has been buried under a century of sensationalized rumors and distortion. That book changed the conversation. By 2015, a new wave of feminist historians began a campaign to re-authenticate Sarah Winchester. They argued a simple, powerful point. Sarah was a woman of immense wealth and independence during the Gilded Age, an era where women in many states weren't permitted to vote, own property, or manage their own finances without male supervision. Yet Sarah did all of those things. She managed a multi-million-dollar fortune. She made independent business decisions. She hired and fired labor. She designed and supervised a complex architectural project that spanned 38 years. And instead of being recognized as a pioneering female executive, she was dismissed as mad. Feminist scholars pointed out the double standard. When Cornelius Vanderbilt built a massive palace with hundreds of rooms, he was called a visionary. When William Randolph Hearst built a castle with 165 rooms and a private zoo, he was called a great media magnate. When Howard Hughes lived in seclusion and developed eccentric habits, he was called an eccentric genius. But when Sarah Winchester built a grand home and lived privately, she was labeled the Mad Widow. The difference? Gender. In 2018, exactly 100 years after California granted women the right to vote, Governor Jerry Brown signed an official proclamation. It stated, Sarah Lockwood Winchester deserves to be recognized not as one haunted by spirits, but as a businesswoman, a philanthropist, and a progressive employer of her time. The proclamation continued. She provided stable employment for dozens of families for nearly 4 decades. She donated millions of dollars to charitable causes, and she created an architectural marvel that still stands over a century later, a testament to the skill of the craftsman who built it and the vision of the woman who designed it. Of course, not everyone agrees. In the comment sections of the internet, you'll still find the skeptics. She was still crazy. Nothing changes that. Feminism has gone too far. What's next? Are we going to celebrate witches? But there are also those who write, finally, women in history deserve to be judged by the same standards as men. My entire view of her changed after reading the new research. And that is the beauty of history. It is not fixed. It changes as we change. In the 1920s, a wealthy, independent woman living alone was seen as unnatural. In the 1950s, her refusal to remarry after her husband's death was seen as strange. In the 1970s, her spiritual beliefs were seen as evidence of instability. But in 2025, a wealthy, independent woman living on her own terms is normal. Not remarrying is a personal choice. Spiritual beliefs are a matter of religious freedom. We don't look at Sarah Winchester differently because she changed. We look at her differently because we have. And perhaps that is the true lesson of the Winchester Mansion. History isn't about the past. It's about how we, in the present, choose to remember the past. And the stories we choose to tell say much more about us than they ever did about them. Let me take you on that walk. On a June afternoon in 1920, when the hammers were still falling and the house was still a living, breathing machine. June 1920, you stand before the wrought iron gates of the Winchester estate, not as a tourist from 2025, but as a delivery man on an ordinary Tuesday morning. You have a parcel, silk from San Francisco, addressed to Mrs. S.L. Winchester. and you are about to experience a world that today no longer exists. The first thing you notice is the sound. The house is not silent. From somewhere deep inside, you hear the rhythmic, persistent strike of hammers, the high-pitched scream of a saw cutting through oak, voices, workmen calling out to one another in English, Spanish, and Italian. And then, the smell. Today, the Winchester Mansion smells like a museum, clean, neutral, a hint of old dust. But in 1920, it smells like a living, breathing construction site, the scent of fresh timber, sweet, vanilla-scented sap from newly cut oak, the sharp tang of paint, linseed oil and mineral pigments, the chalky aroma of wet plaster and lime, and beneath it all, the damp earth from the gardens, roses, orange blossoms, and California soil after a midnight rain. You knock. A woman opens the door. Henrietta Sievers, the housekeeper. She is in her 50s, wearing a crisp black uniform and a stark white apron. Delivery for Mrs. Winchester, you say? Henrietta nods, but she does not invite you in. Instead, she steps outside, pulling the door shut behind her. I'll take it, she says. Mrs. Winchester is resting. As you turn to leave, a man emerges from the side of the house. One of the carpenters, clothes dusted in sawdust, hammer in hand. He stops to drink from a tin ladle at a water barrel. You ask? You work here? He nods. 12 years now. What's it like? He looks up at the massive structure. His gaze isn't one of awe, but something more complex. Strange, he admits. We finished a room last week. Yesterday she told us to rip out the door and move it 3 feet to the left. But the pay is good, the meals are better, and she never raises her voice or treats us poorly. I used to work the shipyards in Oakland. They treated you like livestock. Here, she remembers my name, asks after my boy. So I build the doors that open into walls. I've seen far worse. Now, imagine you aren't the delivery man. Imagine you are a pigeon, able to fly through an open window, and you look inside the home. You see Persian rugs that haven't yet been faded by time, deep crimsons and vibrant golds, crystal chandeliers shimmering in the California sun, not dusty as they are today, but polished weekly. The Tiffany glass panels in the ballroom, the light hitting them, creates rainbows of color across the waxed hardwood floors. In the kitchen, you see 3 cooks preparing lunch for 15 workmen, a massive pot of beef and vegetable stew simmering on the stove, fresh bread cooling on wire racks, the scent of yeast and butter, and a long table where the men will sit for half an hour, not eating hurried scraps on a construction floor, but sitting down in chairs like human beings. And if you are lucky, or unlucky, depending on your view, you might catch a glimpse of her. Sarah Winchester in 1920, 81 years old. Small, barely 4'10", silver hair pulled back in a tight, neat bun. Wearing a simple black dress, not Paris silk, but practical cotton. She moves slowly, excruciatingly slow. Every step is a calculated effort. Her hand grips the railing, fingers gnarled by the arthritis we discussed. She is descending one of her 2-inch staircases. Step. Step. 44 steps to travel 9 feet. But she does it. Without help. Without a wheelchair. Not yet. Not in 1920. Just pure willpower and a staircase engineered precisely for her broken feet. And if you follow her, quietly, respectfully, you'll see her enter her small office, the room where she manages the empire, where she writes the checks for orphanages, where she reviews the blueprints, a walnut roll-top desk, a chair with thick cushions to ease the pressure on her hips, a window looking out at the rose garden, and on the desk, a ledger open to the current page, filled with neat black ink, a stack of letters, some from charities, thanking her for her silent donations, and a photograph, a small photo, in a silver frame, a young man and an infant, William and Annie, the husband and daughter she lost nearly 40 years ago. But they are still here, every day, on the desk. Today, when you tour the Winchester estate, you walk through hollow shells. The museum has removed most of the furniture. There is no smell of plaster, no sound of hammers, no workmen drinking water, no cooks making stew, no Sarah sitting at her desk looking at the roses. Only silence, and the shadows of what once was. But if you listen closely enough, if you stand still in the seance room, or at the foot of that 44-step staircase, you can still hear it. Not a ghost, but an echo, of hammers, of voices, of life, of a house that once lived, and in some way, still refuses to die. And that brings us to the final question, the question I think Sarah Winchester would want us to ask. Let us return to where we began. Midnight in California. The Winchester Mansion stands silent in the dark. The tourists have gone home. The staff has locked the gates. And for the first time today, the house is left truly alone. If you stood outside those gates right now, if you looked up at those darkened windows, you might ask yourself the same question. Are there really ghosts? Is Sarah Winchester still wandering these halls, forever running from the spirits she believed were hunting her? Are the staircases to nowhere truly traps for the afterlife? No, there are no ghosts. There are no curses. There is no portal to hell hidden in the basement. There is only a house built from grief, engineered by illness, and misunderstood by a world that wasn't ready to accept its complexity. But here is the question I want to leave with you. Why do we want to believe in the ghosts? Why, even after knowing the truth, after hearing about the rheumatoid arthritis, the ergonomic blueprints, the $35 million in charity, and John Hansen's sick son, why do we still prefer the ghost story? I think it's because the ghosts are easier. They are simpler. They give us a visible enemy, a neat explanation, a story that can be told in a 30-second soundbite. But pain? Pain is complex. Grief has no clean narrative arc. Chronic illness has no satisfying resolution. And the loneliness, the profound, crushing solitude Sarah Winchester endured for 38 years after losing her only child and her husband, cannot be packaged into a 45-minute tour. We like stories with clear villains, vengeful spirits, curses that can be broken, mysteries that can be solved. But real life isn't like that. Real life is a 42-year-old woman standing by the bed of her 6-week-old daughter, watching her stop breathing. A 43-year-old woman holding her husband's hand as he coughs up blood from tuberculosis. A 67-year-old woman trying to stand in the morning, only to find her knees will no longer permit it. There are no ghosts in those moments, only absence, only agony, only the question that is never answered, why? And Sarah Winchester, like millions of others before and after her, searched for an answer. She found it in spiritualism, in the conviction that if she kept building, kept moving, kept doing, then perhaps the pain would have a meaning, perhaps the loss would have a purpose. Perhaps she could build something out of the grief, something beautiful, something permanent, something that mattered. And she did. Not by building a house for ghosts, but by providing stable, dignified work for dozens of families for nearly 4 decades, paying fair wages when most titans were exploiting, covering the medical care for her workers, children when they fell ill, donating millions to people who would never even know her name, and creating an architectural marvel that, however bizarre, still stands over a century later, teaching us about adaptive design, about creativity born from limitation, and about how one person can transform agony into purpose. That is the true legacy. Not the curse, not the ghosts, but the compassion, the persistence, and the ability to see the human being, even when the world only sees a monster. So when you leave here, when you think of Sarah Winchester and her strange home, I hope you will ask not, are there ghosts? But, when I am in pain, what will I build? When I suffer loss, what will I leave behind? And when the world doesn't understand me, when they call me mad for what I must do to survive, Will I have the courage to continue? Because that is the question Sarah Winchester answered every single day for 38 years. And her answer was to keep building, no matter what they said, no matter how much it hurt. Keep building. Until you create something that even death cannot destroy. A legacy in timber and glass. A house that refuses to be forgotten. And a story, the real story, that is finally being told. But there is one final detail we need to talk about. Something Sarah herself would want us to know. More than a century after Sarah Winchester passed away, the Winchester Mansion is still making money. A lot of money. Let me show you the numbers. Annual revenue, over $10 million. Visitor count, 300,000 people per year. Average adult ticket, $45. Merchandise revenue, an additional $2 million. Special events, Halloween, midnight tours, weddings, another $1.5 million. Total, roughly $13 to $14 million every single year. From a house built from grief. From the story of a woman who died in solitude. From the Winchester, blood money. So the question is, who benefits from this legacy today? How much of that $14 million actually goes toward preserving the house? How much goes to the people who truly work here? The guides, the maintenance crews, the artisans carefully replacing rotted wood. And how much continues to line the pockets of the entities behind the tourism curtain? Let's perform an audit, much like the one Sarah performed for her workmen, but this time for the modern estate. Full-time staff, approximately 50 people, 25 tour guides, 10 maintenance staff, 8 ticketing agents, 7 management personnel. Average wages, tour guides, $18 to $22 per hour, roughly $40,000 per year. Maintenance, $22 to $28 per hour, roughly $50,000 per year. Management, $60,000 to $80,000 per year. Total payroll, roughly $2.5 to $3 million per year. To put that in perspective, Sarah paid $3 a day in 1895. Adjusted for inflation, that is roughly $95 a day today, or about $24 an hour for manual labor. The modern tour guide wage? $18 to $22 an hour. So the people telling the story of Sarah's generosity are actually being paid less than the people Sarah paid 130 years ago. Annual preservation costs. The Winchester Mansion is a designated California historical landmark. That means every repair must use original materials or authentic equivalents. Be performed by certified historical restoration artisans. Comply with strict conservation standards. A real-world example, replacing 100 square feet of walnut flooring. Materials, aged California walnut, $25,000. Labor, certified restoration carpenters, $18,000. Total, $43,000 for just 100 square feet. Repairing a single Tiffany glass window, damage assessment, $2,000. Restoration, if possible, $15,000 to $30,000. Total replacement, if destroyed, $50,000 to $100,000. Estimated annual preservation budget, $1.5 to $2 million. So let's do the math. Revenue, $14 million. Minus personnel, $3 million. Preservation, $2 million. Operations, utilities, insurance, $1.5 million. Marketing, $1 million. Total expenses, $7.5 million. Net profit, roughly $6 to $7 million per year. Where does that $7 million go? The Winchester Mystery House is currently owned by Winchester Mystery House, LLC, a private company. They aren't required to open their books to the public, but according to limited public filings and tax reports, the majority of that profit is distributed to private shareholders. Only an estimated 10 to 15% is reinvested back into preservation. Remember, Sarah Winchester donated $2 million, $35 million today, to charity in her lifetime. She left life-changing sums to her staff in her will. She paid 50% above the market rate. She saw the house not as a profit center, but as a project of purpose. But today, the house is exactly what she never wanted it to become: a money-making machine, a tourist trap that sells the curse instead of the truth, a legacy where the ghost story generates more revenue than the story of human kindness. So here is the final question I want to leave with you. If Sarah Winchester could see her house today, if she could see 300,000 people a year walking through her rooms, hearing tales of curses and ghouls, would she feel her legacy has been honored? Or would she see that, once again, death is being transformed into profit? I don't have an answer for that. But I know this. There are two ways to tell the Winchester story. The first, a mad widow building a house for ghosts. It's scary. It's mysterious. It sells tickets. The second, a woman in chronic pain, turning blood money into wages, turning guilt into construction, turning agony into purpose. The first way is easier. The second way is truer. Sarah Winchester inherited a $20 million fortune in 1881. That is $600 million today. She spent $5,150,000 million today to build the house. She gave away $2,035 million today to charity. She paid millions in wages over 38 years. And when she died, she left behind a house that generates $10 to $14 million every year. For over 100 years, total cumulative revenue, over $1 billion. So this is the real legacy of Sarah Winchester. She took money from death, and she turned it into something that generates life. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't simple, but it was real. And perhaps that is the best way to measure a life. Not by what you inherit, but by what you leave behind. Not by how you are remembered, but by how you continue to provide for others, for people you will never meet, in eras you will never see. Sarah Winchester built a house for ghosts, but in the end, she left behind a house for people. And that is all any of us can ever hope to do.